Salvatore Tirabassi is a fractional CFO and financial forecasting expert. He helps growing businesses build sophisticated financial models. They help drive their own strategic decisions. He has expertise integrating operational data into financial planning, specializes in creating three-statement financial forecasts that serve businesses and their functions from budgeting to investor relations. Today, we are talking with Salvatore about his experience incorporating AI into finance tools and managing AI-enabled work in this new world that we're experiencing. So one of the things we speak about frequently at ClickTime is the significance of labor cost in terms of a line item for most organizations, especially project-driven ones. The challenge involved in measuring the results of that labor can be overwhelming for a lot of organizations. The division of time between projects is how we've approached that. But Salvatore, I want to spend some time discussing your experience of this challenge, both firsthand and through some of your clients that you've counseled. So, what I'd like to start our conversation off with is, can you tell us what it looks like when labor cost data is unreliable and where that might show up first in an organization?
So it can vary based on the type of business model that it is. If the labor costs are not being tracked carefully, or they're happening kind of in another part of the organization where we'll see them first is in the gross margins, and we'll have questions about why are these gross margins too high or too low relative to what we had originally forecasted. If the client is more sophisticated and they actually have project costing models that are also using the time tracking, you'll also see it there. But it just depends on the level of sophistication of the organization. As like in a totally different environment where you're using time tracking for tech development and you're trying to figure out the costs of development time that's going into developing a product, a new version, or doing maintenance, um, those types of costs are usually a little harder to detect when they're kind of off kilter. And the way we usually see them is we actually have like an assignment to really figure out like the costing of a specific asset, like a software asset or something like that. And then we'll backtrack into how the data is being collected and we'll see it there. Sometimes someone else in the organization who has a lot of awareness of how much things should cost or have a sense of like the gross value of something. Sometimes you'll be in a conversation with them and they'll just say they'll be looking at a financial statement or an analysis with you and they'll just say, "Hey, that number looks wrong and here's why." And then as you dig into it, you'll figure out that there's some kind of time tracking cost problem that is further upstream that you need to get to the bottom.
Yeah, so you mentioned gross margin specifically, which is obviously a really significant metric. Have you seen situations where a company's financial position might have been affected because they couldn't back up where some of the time to projects were going? And maybe what might be some examples of that?
Yeah, so I definitely seen it in audit situations where a company is being audited. Usually for the first time, it can be a subsequent audit where the auditor is just testing a different part of the company that they haven't really dug into as deeply before. And where I've seen it is it was on the tech side in terms of justifying the value of certain assets on the balance sheet that were related to software development. And the effect was ultimately that we could justify everything, but it significantly slowed down the progress of the audit. And it also really introduced a lot of extra work and time into the managers of the development team because they had to go back and really figure out how to justify the cost that they had kind of presented as going into this specific software asset. It was actually a few assets in their instance, and that obviously is problematic, especially if you're in very rapid kind of development cycles. All of a sudden now your managers can't focus on getting the new releases out. They've got to take a bunch of time in their day to do all this administrative work that really, if you had done it properly from the beginning, you never would have had to deal with it. Um, but that's usually the place that I've seen it most often, and um, you know, sometimes it's come up in gross margin in certain businesses where they're more project based businesses, and in those instances, uh, gross margin moved in a really negative direction, and then the company's cash planning for a specific project had to be changed pretty dramatically. It didn't affect the company overall, but the specific project that was causing the problem needed to be refactored with a different approach in order to keep it profitable.
Hmm. The story of our, labor cost records are in unreadable or not useful. That's a familiar story to us, and it's a reason that we've seen many customers come to QuickTime, of course. But there are so many methods of gathering labor data, whether it's kind of HR driven timesheets or employees are self reporting based on a survey. In your experience, as you see different organizations try to track the cost of their projects and the amount of labor that has contributed to each of those projects, whether they're using a timesheet or a self reported survey or estimates at the managerial level, how often do you see that that holds up in a financial environment and when the finance team needs to access those numbers? Specifically, like we mentioned, you said that might show up in an audit or for forecasting, um, budget review. So, what has that looked like in your experience?
Yeah, well, in the finance world, you've got this whole concept of the general ledger, which is tracking all of the financial transactions of the business, and then you've got this concept of subledgers, which are the backup numbers that justify everything that's in the financial ledger. I just view the timesheets as another subledger that obviously has time and dollars tied to it, and it doesn't necessarily produce a specific entry into the accounting system, but it's really the substantive backup of what goes into the accounting system, and it's also the substantive backup that gives you the ability to do forecasting, because you can use all that raw data to figure out, like, how much does a development cycle take for a specific product? And then you can use all that information for that as well. But in terms of holding up for a review or for an audit, the information doesn't need to be fancy or sophisticated. It just needs to be readable, organized with the correct time stamping and the correct metadata that's associated with it so that a third party that's looking at it can make sense of how you got from, this raw data to a specific value that you're putting either on your balance sheet or on your income statement.
Yeah, you make a really good point there with the importance of the categorization. And that's one of the challenges that we frequently hear teams running into is the finance team when it comes time for an audit or a review of some sort. They are forced to comb through HR style time tracking and match that up with whether it be salary or payroll data. And so there's a lot of manual work for something that as you say, should be straightforward. So that's very familiar. You also mentioned that this concept of a subledger item, and I think that contributes sometimes to a finance team or another team potentially overlooking time and time records as an asset to their business. Again, for forecasting or reporting. So what might be some ways that time and labor cost data, well categorized, clean, useful, how might that represent an asset to the business when it comes to planning?
Well, I think that raw data, if you can keep it in, pretty simple data store and build, I'm biased toward Power BI just because it comes pretty much free with Microsoft's enterprise apps, but you could use Power BI to build an estimation calculator uh, that will access the raw data. You can kind of go in there and say, give me the average time of development across different development cycles or different products. Also, really limit it to certain developers that are on staff. And that gives you a really good indication, not just from a finance standpoint, but also from an operational standpoint of how to justify how long things take. It also gives you the ability to do comparisons for similar tasks as well. So, if you've got some people on your team that are, very fast and efficient and they're leveraging all kinds of tools to get their work done, you could do comparisons of similarly tiered personnel on your team to figure out who's more efficient than not, which, by the way, goes into like coaching, improving your team, but also identifying like um, with quantitative data, your highest performers who you might want to leverage more to do bigger and, more critical projects for you.
Yeah, it's really full circle between finance, operations, HR. The sort of data has kind of far reaching ramifications. And one of the things you had mentioned to me previously was that a lot of leaders don't even have access to this sort of data to be able to have these conversations to begin with.
Yeah, for sure.
You'd also mentioned at one point, you and I have talked previously, and you've mentioned that technical teams in particular often resist time tracking. So, what might be the downstream effect of that, especially for a finance team?
Yeah, I mean, I've encountered this, on a few different occasions. I had somebody on my team actually working for one client where the CTO, who apparently had been CTO at like multiple orgs of varying sizes, basically said, "Yeah, I've never had to track data for capitalization purposes, and I'm not going to start now." And he had to point out to him that this business is going to need to be audited, and these assets that are being booked to the balance sheet need to be supported with the amount of time that the developers are taking in building out various components of the systems. So I think it it is either something that if you've been a CTO or a technical person in a company that is maybe smaller and has never been had to be audited before, or has never gone out to go get like serious financing, you may be unaware of the need to do this kind of stuff. Um, and and then also then when you introduce the topic to them, this becomes like an administrative burden. And developers want to be developing and building stuff, the really good ones. And even I would say even the managers, are really most interested in that. And there's a bit of an alignment issue that you could have where you really have to, you know, describe it as like a operational priority for the business that really has up downstream ramifications if it's not done correctly that will hurt the business in other ways. And that's really how you try to that's at least how I would try to get alignment around those issues.
Yeah. And then obviously it's a much easier sell if they can have their time collected and not have to track it themselves at all, which we'll get to.
Yeah, or even that, now all of a sudden they've got the power of the data to actually enhance their own productivity, right? As I said, they can like figure out factually who's more productive on the team and then change incentives, retrain people, just could make their life a lot easier.
One of the areas that I also wanted to explore a little bit is the scenario where you've got a team billing for their time. So whether that's in a marketing and advertising, consulting, IT services implementation type environment. I'm curious what those challenges might look like and how they might be different for the finance team where time literally equals money.
Yeah, I think the big item there is just being able to get invoices out on time. And if you have a more streamlined workflow and process with accurate time tracking, data assigning time to specific projects and clients, and then an approval process that is streamlined and then feeding into the accounts receivable side of the business, which would include invoicing. Um, you really want to remove the human elements as much as possible and the back and forth conversations, um, in that process. And that's really, I think, where it, has the most value. Um, and the just the time to get invoices out is always like a big deal in those types of businesses. Now on on kind of the back end of it, like when you've collected that data successfully and you've got it very well meta tagged and you can do a lot of analysis with it. Again, it goes back to what I said about on the tech side, where you can figure out who your most productive resources are, and then you leverage that for coaching, retraining, um, and just improving the overall quality of your team.
Yeah, thanks for that. We also touched on a little bit earlier what good labor cost or time data looks like, especially from the perspective of a controller or CFO. So, can you describe a little bit about if you were implementing a labor cost tracking solution for a client, what specifically would you be looking for to make sure it's meeting their needs for kind of all of the use cases that we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, what I would say to anybody who's looking at this problem, when you look at the data output, you should ask yourself a question, which is basically, if I took this raw data the way it's constructed in this table and had someone on my team drop it into a database, how flexible is it in terms of helping me answer strategic and tactical questions? And it goes back to, does it tag it by person? Does it tag it by location? Does it tag it by project? Are there subcategories that you need to track to by client? You really want to have just maximum flexibility. There's no reason, also, in my opinion, in this day and age, if you got a new, up to date time tracking system, that it wouldn't give you the full flexibility that you need. And so that that strength in any one of those products that you might be looking at is really critical, because if you're going to go through the effort of implementing this, right, you don't want to be thinking like 6 or 9 months down the line, oh, I wish we had this data piece, this data variable collected because we need to do XYZ analysis. You know, from my standpoint, when it comes to data generation, if you can plan to collect everything from the beginning, you might as well. Storage is cheap. And then any given day of the week when you decide you need to do something differently or look at it differently, the data is already there and you can just analyze it however you want. And then obviously, the exportability of the data is another thing where, having API feeds, if they're available, into specific data repositories, but also, you know, I'm really big on efficiency in the actual workflows, as they, whatever the workflow might be. I've been in systems not necessarily related to time tracking, where you go to do a download of a CSV, and for whatever reason, that CSV's got certain limitations on what you can download that are really unrelated to permissioning or anything like that. It's just like it only lets you download these fields. And it's like, well, I kind of need these other fields. And then you got to go to IT, and then your whole ability to just execute quickly is completely changed. Now you got to put a ticket in. They've got to download it from the back end. In the meantime, people are like asking 20 questions about why is it like this, and there's just a lot of noise that happens around that stuff. So if the data's there, you want it to be maximally flexible in terms of the fields, but then you also want the accessibility of it to be maximally flexible, both in terms of just clicking a button to do a download to a CSV so you can manipulate it on your desktop, to having an API that just dumps it into some database or some, AI workflow that you've got running in the background. Those are things that you just kinda have to have, and you should check them before you decide on not just time tracking technology, but it could be pretty much anything.
Those are great words for anybody shopping for financial or finance adjacent software. And I think if I were to summarize what you shared, it would come down to the importance of the quality and consistency of the data itself, and then the accessibility.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. That being said, we're talking about data. That's a great transition into AI. And it's top of everybody's minds. From your seat, what are challenges that finance's role is facing now that everyone is using AI for their own work? So whether that's related to tracking, reporting, forecasting, budgeting, just very broadly, what sorts of significant challenges is AI introducing?
I've heard a lot of people in finance complain about hallucinations. Um, and they're sort of like, "Oh, we implemented the system and we were feeding it our own data, and for whatever reason, there's a gap there, and then it would produce results that had some hallucinations in it." Almost as if the AI is kind of on autopilot, and it views answering the question or producing the chart or table as more important than the steps behind it that, give it the correct data. It's like, "Oh, I'm just gonna show you this, trend progression," and then somebody looks at the data and is just like, "Well, that's obviously not our data." So I've heard a few people complain about that, and the responses that I've seen in some of these communities that I'm in are like, "Well, you need to be more specific with what you're asking," or, "Are you sure there isn't any like data leaking into the system?" And some of the answers are like, "No, we don't have any of that. It's just doing its own thing." Um, so I think that's just one thing that you need to be cognizant of. Don't just turn it on, assume that it's doing everything correctly. I would say, create a list of tasks, like list of tests, like from 1 to 10 in terms of complexity, and kinda go through each one systematically to see how it does, depending on what data it's accessing. And that's really all just part of a general sort of QA process, which you should not forego once you decide that it's actually doing the job correctly, right? You don't just, you know, get a report produced and then just stick it in some email and email it to like 10 people in your organization and think that it's reliable. You need to really go through it and kind of understand what it says and use common sense to determine, whether it's suitable for general consumption or not. I think the other thing that I would say related to that is if you're, as a financial analyst, the hardest part of being a financial analyst is separating the grunt work from the thought leadership part of it. If you're too bogged down in the grunt work, getting data to be assembled and doing all that, it gives you very little time to digest the results and then be able to, speak intelligently to it and add value. So what I say is, don't, uh, give away that don't give away your ability to add value to the data just because you think AI can do it. What you should do is use AI to do all the grunt work, and then use your own skill and know-how to really come up with the insights and, leverage AI to like enhance how you're developing your insights. Um, and that automatically puts you into this mode of quality controlling what's coming out of the system. And that's where I say, experience matters when you're prompting the AI. This is, you need to understand what it is that you're analyzing and what kinds of outcomes you're trying to achieve in order to properly have the heavy duty lifting done by the AI and then take its output and be able to turn it into something that's value added to the people that you want to share it with.
Which in many ways sounds to me like the influence and value of a knowledgeable CFO analyst could be multiplied many times over across an organization. Be-
Yeah, definitely. And you could just go faster, you know. With the types of analysis you're doing. You could have a situation where, you know, some cost is out of line with expectations, and it could be a very, very murky thing to try to figure out what's causing it. And AI connected to the right systems can actually expose the data drivers much more readily so that you can kind of figure out like, hey, why did this happen? And then you can kind of backtrack more easily. So that allows you to just go faster.
Yeah, yeah, and then something like accessible labor cost data then powers you further. You've got the data to speak to the problem, then you've got the expertise to be able to do something about it.
Correct.
I really appreciated earlier how you shared some of the basic qualities that labor cost or time data must have to be useful to an analyst, CFO, controller. Specifically, we talked about the consistency and accessibility of the data. What about when we're talking about AI powered time tracking tools specifically? For a CFO who's looking at this new world of automated time collection, what kinds of questions should they be asking themselves, especially about audit defensibility and security?
Well, are there any openings for hallucination, particularly on outputs if the system comes with like an analytical tool with it that allows you to query it? Um, are there any backdoors in the system that could create phantom hours or cause certain hours to like disappear from the system? Um, going back to the data schema, is it a flexible ledger of hours that is enables easy automation of querying and also downloading and consumption? Um, SOC compliance, depending on, where your organization sits in kind of the size of organizations that you're selling to, that may be a very important aspect of the vendor you're choosing. The logging of users and entries so that there's an audit trail. Uh, don't discount the need in the data layer to actually also know when certain things were changed in the system. You might need that. For example, like if there's let's say 100 entries were changed because there was an error, can you identify who went in and made the change to correct them when that was done? You want to be able to have that audit trail, so that at a later date, if you ever need to explain why certain things were changed, you know who to go ask, or maybe there's, certain notations that are in there. Um, and that information layer, which is like one layer below the actual data, is that queryable by AI? Can AI actually work on that data as well? Because if you do need to do like an audit trail analysis, you don't want the AI to be working on like all of the obvious stuff and then not be able to access the audit trail info. You might as well have it do everything. Um, the permissioning, um, what is the AI allowed to expose to specific users? So you might have like user level permissioning, which most people would be familiar with. Like, I'm a certain level, I can see this. I'm at another level and I can only see this. Well, if those two people go in and query the AI, how does it report back to the person who has lower level permissioning? Does it just say, I can't show you that? Does it reinterpret the data in a way that, is, at a level of detail that they are allowed to see? Those are, different things that you want to think about. And then the last thing is, that I can think of is there a human in the loop in terms of approving the data that's going into it? Um, because, you know, someone ultimately needs to be responsible for the veracity of the information. It can't just be a machine that's on all the time and just doing it on its own. They're going to want to know, an auditor or like a compliance person is going to want to know, like, hey, who signed off on this? And you need to have that part as part of the workflow.
Mm, yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to contextualize some of these AI specific observations. So, you've developed a level of pattern recognition over more than 25 years of experience. And so, what I'd like to do is speak to some specific roles or titles that might be experiencing some of these challenges, and what they should specifically be thinking about. So, in the case of a CFO or a controller whose labor cost data is not clean enough for an audit right now, maybe they're facing an audit, maybe they expect to in the next 3 to 5 years. What would be some recommendations you would give them, especially considering what's available now with AI tools?
Yeah, I would say, um, plan ahead. Um, Look at what types of information that you have today, and, is it simple spreadsheets? Is it HR-related timesheets? Is it project plans with assigned hours? You wanna basically know what data you have available to you so that you could start to make sense of how you would utilize this in order to justify whatever cost accounting you're doing with that you have done in the past. You may have done a bunch of cost accounting that was, like, done at a very aggregate level and with, like, cost data that came, with an invoice that you produced to a client or just aggregated payroll data that you just divided up. You need to start to figure out how do you justify that with the this kind of subledger data, and that may be coming from a lot of different resources, so that can be very time consuming and frankly, a annoying to do, and very tedious, so you wanna get ahead of that. The other thing I would say is, Um, if you're going through an audit, obviously your auditors are generally going to be reluctant to advise you on like the kinds of information that they would deem acceptable. So what you should do is if you're really educated on it is, you know, go through your network and find auditors that you know who are not working for you and ask them for some advice on like, hey, I got this problem, how can I navigate this? And do you have any ideas of things that you might deem acceptable? Um, and then start to use those ideas to uh, in your own organization so that you can generate the type of information that is going to be acceptable to help you pass these audit requirements. Um, and then demonstrate that you're thinking of improving processes and procedures. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to go out and buy a piece of software. You can put that like on a bit of a roadmap. But if you have documented SOPs that you can write up as part of the audit process that demonstrate like, hey, we're in this world and here's how we take payroll data and convert it to cost data, or here's how we take payroll timesheets and convert them to project timesheets. Y- Show that you have a methodology that you're following, and that takes time. But write it down into an SOP, do some testing on it so that you know that it works and that it stands up to, the data that you're giving to the auditors. This gives you a lot more credibility that you're not just, going with the current status quo and not really trying to resolve the issues. I think auditors, generally will give you some credit for improving the situation and actually having documented procedures, even if the data is not as great as it needs to be.
Mm. The piece of advice there about seeking wisdom from outside your own organization and then outside your own audit firm is a wise one. And then I also appreciate the effort included, the showing of effort and how that can go a long way with your auditor. Obviously, tracking time data is both a tooling issue and a structural procedural issue. And so putting in place some of those structures and processes, as you mentioned, can go a long way to get you started. What would you say to a controller or CFO who says that gathering some of that subledger level data, specifically time or project cost data, isn't really a priority, um, doesn't think it's going to have much impact, whether that be for compliance reasons or the forecasting or more aspirational side of things?
I think you got to educate them on the bigger picture. that this organization has certain goals and priorities that are related to making it a bigger, better, higher performing organization. We may have fundraising requirements. We may have better cash flow management requirements. We may want to be best in class in development. Um, those are all kind of more strategic topics that are driven by the day to day work. And it gives them more context about how this day to day effort that they need to put in is going to translate into you know, more important priorities for the overall organization. I think it's really an alignment thing at the end of the day. And you got to get people on board with direction of improving things and being more sophisticated because that's what the business demands.
Mm, I'm going to combine these next two for time. So, as we look at the impact of AI in being able to gather consistent and accessible data, based on what you've seen and your experience over the last several years, how do you think that AI is going to change how finance accesses this sort of data? And the second part of the question is the Office of Finance ready for that? What might have to be in place for them to be ready for that?
Well, um, I think AI in this area is really going to start to become more capable in its domain of expertise. And it's going to be able to give you the ability to sort of solve a lot of different time tracking issues, in one solution. And that's really good for the finance organization because, having one system to kind of rule them all when it comes to time tracking is like a big benefit to a finance team. It gives them, consolidation of information, streamlining how they use APIs into other systems. It allows them to also build standard workflows around it for their own purposes. So, you know, I think the other thing that good AI is going to do is it's going to also have um, alerting capabilities and the ability to kind of identify, I'll just say in general speak, like red, yellow, green issues in the data that it outputs to you. Whether you're asking it to give you a report or a summary, it'll develop more awareness of the kinds of questions you're asking and also what sort of things you track over time, so that it becomes a lot more automated in terms of giving you outputs that are more readily usable. Um, and I think the flexibility to plug into different systems and have its data routed around in a way that becomes useful to other people in the org is also going to be an important step. And then, what was the second question again?
Yeah, is the Office of Finance ready for that? So what sorts of things might have to be true first for some of these AI-enabled, time data collection, tools to really be useful?
I think the probably are they going to be ready question is really related to how many other AI solutions in finance are competing for their attention, because the AI is trying to attack all these AI vendors are trying to attack problems in finance from all sorts of directions, time tracking being one of them. And I think that's really going to be a question of like how ready are they? Is how are they prioritizing what they're going to be leveraging AI for, and how are they discerning what's most important to get done first? That's really going to be sort of the limiting factor. I think tech savviness plays into a certain degree also. Um, And there's definitely, like, a little bit of an adoption curve that people need to go to, so that'll be a bit of a blocker as well. But I think, AI is much easier to use than many other platforms, so especially if you could just query and, just ask it questions. So I don't view that as, like, as big of a stumbling block. I think it's that there's gonna be a lot of systems that claim improvements and which ones are being adopted when. um, is going to be the biggest roadblock.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, Thank you very much. I think we'll close it there.